2 in the replay. So thanks for joining us, everyone, all of the aspiring architects around Australia, whether you're a student or a graduate. Today we are going to be talking about the new PALS program. In a nutshell, PALS, which stands for the Practice of Architecture Learning Series, is a course run by the Australian Institute of Architects to prepare aspiring architects for the registration process. So I've already said welcome to everyone who's joining us, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm hosting from today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And welcome to Otto from the Institute of Architects, who's kindly agreed to answer all of our questions today. Thanks so much for joining us today, Otto.
No worries, thank you.
So Otto, a few weeks ago, I was really excited to receive in my inbox a notification that PALS has had a bit of a revamp, certainly since I did it. So I reached out to see who I could chat to about this, and you put your hand up, so thanks for that. Before we hone in on the PALS course itself, could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. So I'm also a registered architect here in New South Wales. I'm in Sydney, and I graduated with my master's degree in South Africa. Worked there for a couple of years, and then I moved to London, where I worked for an architecture practice there for more or less 2 years before finally immigrating to Australia and to Sydney. Worked for 2 years for architectural practice, and then I moved on to the Institute of Architects. And one of my first jobs was to review the PALS program. And yeah, the rest is pretty much why we're here tonight.
And for everyone watching, that's a cracking pace of career development there. Did you get registered in any of the other countries, Otto?
Yeah, so I was actually registered in South Africa as well, and we have exactly the same program where after your master's degree, you have to work for 2 years, then do your exam. So when I found out I had to do my exam over here, I was less than pleased, but pretty much anybody coming from any country except from New Zealand has to go through that route. So yeah. So I did it.
Wow, you've been through it twice. That no wonder you're the managing it now. You've got more experience than anyone else.
Exactly. It's crazy to see how in different countries, even in the UK, how similar the contracts are. So yeah, it's just got a little bit of different terminology, but at the end of the day, the crux of the contracts are exactly the same.
Yeah, okay. So, that's really interesting to know for any who might be thinking about studying overseas when they can get over there. So your involvement is largely with the Australian Institute of Architects and the PALS program. So I want to give people watching a quick who's who when it comes to registration. We'll be mentioning different bodies today. So there's generally 3 bodies that you need to know. One is the Architects Accreditation Council of Australia. They're often referred to as the AACA, and they maintain the national standards of competency for architects, and they run the registration process on behalf of each state or territory's registration board. So that's number 2, that your state or territory's registration board. They manage the registration or licensing within that jurisdiction. So in simpler terms, the AACA decide what you need to know and how to test you on that knowledge. And then once you've passed, your local board can legally register you. They make sure you conduct yourself appropriately, and they maintain your annual professional development if that's required in your jurisdiction. So then thirdly, the Australian Institute of Architects. It's the peak membership body for architects in Australia. And if you've studied here, you might be familiar with their student arm, SONA, or the graduate arm, Imagine. So they run PALS, this registration preparation service that we're talking about today. And I want to note here that there was a recent event held by Parla who spoke to Kate Doyle, the CEO of the AACA, and they spoke about the various pathways that you can approach to registration in a lot of detail. They haven't put the link up for that yet, but I'm going to pop the link to keep an eye on that in the notes for this, so that you can find it when it's available, because it will really complement what we're talking about today. So today we'll be mainly referring to that traditional pathway towards registration, but do keep in mind that there are alternate pathways, such as the one Otto had to take, being a foreign trained architect. So Otto, could you give us a quick overview of what that traditional registration process is in Australia?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, huge disclaimer, please go make sure that you always go check out the AACA's website. As Sarah's mentioned, the pathways to register is really clearly set out. You just have to choose what is your pathway, either if it's overseas or if it's the more common route where you have graduated with your master's program either over here or New Zealand, or you have it accredited. And to gain the experience of preparation for sitting for the architecture practice exam, there's three things that you need to do. First, you need to submit your logbook. You need a minimum of 3,300 hours for this under the supervision of an architect across 15 areas of competencies and various levels of autonomy. You also need a minimum of 2 years practical experience and a statement of practical experience. For the exam, please again, go check out on the Architects Registration Board. They will set out the dates and exactly what the requirements are. For example, this year, they are not writing it in one facility or designated areas. Because of COVID, it will be remotely, so it will, for example, be in your house or at the office, and there are very strict rules in terms of how they are managing that. But in my case, I wrote the exam where it was 75 minutes. It was on a computer, and it consisted of 9 scenarios, with each scenario had 5 multiple choice questions and 4 optional answers, one of which is correct. So just please note that this is new, and somewhat simplified format was introduced in 2018. And so it is different from what many of your experienced colleagues might have done. You can view a sample of the exam questions on the AACA's website. And then after that, you have the interview, which is normally between 45 minutes to 60 minutes with experienced local practitioners. There's normally 2 of them. In my case, I also had a third person who was an observer. And I think it's also quite important to point out here that in my case, I would say you have to remember, when you have that interview, that's the last step. And you should see it as almost having a conversation with your peers, because they are basically at the end of the day just checking whether you are going to be a responsible architect, and if you go out there and not get sued left, right, and center, or do something irresponsible. And it depends as well. So for me personally, the interview was quite easy. I could say probably it was easier than the exam. The exam I barely scraped through. So, but again, for the next person, it might be a different story. But yeah, that's pretty much the most common route that you would follow.
Yeah, I think it's a really, it's a pretty intense and involved process, and a lot of students perhaps and graduates perhaps don't realize that. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding that you can just work for 2 years and then sort of go for registration. But there are a lot of checks and measures to check that you're really meeting the criteria. And if you, I think we were talking before we started that we were scared of failing, and I know some very successful architects who did take several attempts to get through the process. And if you pass your exam but then fail the interview, you don't have to do the exam again. You just resit the interview at the next round. So yeah, it's not something to feel that it's the be all and end all, I guess. It's not like a year 12 exam. You get to try again if
Absolutely.
you don't go that well.
And I think something that was really interesting for me when I started working at the Institute is, obviously I spoke to quite a bit of graduates, and it was so interesting hearing different approaches. And some of them actually said, well, we're really seeing our first round of the exams as a practice run. We're really setting ourselves out to fail, and that's it. We're going to work hard, we're going to write the exams, we're going to study everything, but if we fail, so what? It's just a practice run. And if you pass, yay, amazing, fantastic. But if not, then you know what to do for the next round, you know where to go study, you know how to prepare yourself. And that takes a huge amount of stress away from you. And I wish I actually did it the first round. Luckily, I passed it. But like I said, it might help to take the stress away just to see your first round. That's why PALS, you also have access to it for a year, exactly for part of that reason. And also, if you do fail, then you can sit it for the second round again.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. So let's talk about PALS. Whereabouts in the approach to registration would someone enroll in PALS? And we should ask, what exactly is PALS?
Yeah, sure. Um, it's difficult to say when exactly you should enroll for PALS. I think the best would be probably to go to the ARB's website and get the date that you have to submit your logbook. You know you have to have 2 years to
That's
submit
your
your
local
logbook.
board that's sort of
Yeah,
running it all, and they'll tell you the dates that for your region.
exactly. And they also oversee the exams. So they will set the dates, everything. So any questions or queries you have regarding the exams or the dates or the logbook, everything, that is ARB, because they ultimately have to check it. So I would use my logbook date as almost my endpoint and work my way back. Because after you've submitted your logbook, you've got more or less 2 months before the exam. So you can pretty much decide if that is enough time for you. If it's not, then you know, okay, this is the logbook date. How much time do I need? Do I need 6 months? Some people need 6 months, some a year. And then you can start planning your route from there. So that would be my advice. Use the logbook date, work your way back. In terms of what PALS is, and as I mentioned before, that was pretty much my role when I started there, is to review the program that's already been running for 20 years, and what could we do to improve it, and what could we do to just streamline the process a bit more. So currently, the new and improved program includes 21 pre-recorded online modules that you can complete in your own time. The final module is on preparing the exam, and it is presented by an APE examiner, which is a really must-see. The main reference material for the program is the Acumen Practice Notes. And for those of you who don't know what the Acumen Practice Notes are, it's a bit like Wikipedia, but for architects. So the Institute had prepared this over years and years. Experts and architects, as soon as there's something that is a little bit unclear or that we have to have knowledge, it's literally an online library, of anything that we would use in our profession. So if you need something on procurement, you go to Acumen, search procurement, and there would be a number of papers that was checked and approved by a panel, and it would give you an explanation on what is procurement. So it's really quite handy. I didn't know about that before I studied, but really quite handy when you start with that. What is also included in PALS, and I'm currently busy with the third session of that now, is the online sessions, which is pretty much the same as today, except for we have a facilitator, myself, and then 2 or 3 expert architects. And then we go through a couple of case studies and questions that you guys might have. So we take the exam date and we work our way back. And a couple of Fridays before that, we cover a couple of case studies, questions, and just work through the 21 modules on a very slow pace, just so that you can get into depth in terms of the modules and just to gain some extra knowledge in the virtual classroom. And that's pretty much PALS.
Great. Yeah, I was checking out the new program online, and it describes what the 21 modules of learning cover. So I'll read them out to give everyone who's listening an idea of what you study when you do PALS. So we've got what is the law, what is a contract, authority approvals and planning approvals, professional indemnity insurance, practice management, risk management, commissions and briefs, services fees and agreements, consultants, client architect agreement part 1 and then part 2, project cost control, moral and ethical rights, building procurement, tendering, contracts, contract terminology and introduction to ABIC, contract administration framework, contract administration finance, contract administration time, and preparation for the written exam and interview. It's a pretty intimidating list of topics, and I remember looking at PALS when I was thinking about going for it, and it made me question whether I was even ready to attempt registration. What drives that selection of topics that you study in PALS?
Yeah, sure. So I think especially with the new online modules, the new PALS modules, what we looked at is basically a hypothetical scenario where we try to follow the path or the route of an architect who wants to start his or her own practice. And what would be that path or that route of that architect? So, for example, I want to start my practice. What is the first thing that I need to know? I need to know the Australian law. I need to know what the legislation is that is binding to my state or territory. Then after that, I need to know, I have to have some sort of insurance in my company. And I need to have some practice management. I need to know whether I'm a sole practitioner or an individual, sole or individual or a partnership. How does that work? And then after that, you would start going to a little bit more depth. Now you need to get a client because you need to get work. You need to pay the bills. So what's the next step? You are going over to finding a client, and you need to understand now what is the client architect agreement and how do you brief your client? What is a brief? And then et cetera, we just went through that route. Like, for example, after you've appointed them, you're now going over to find builders. Do you go out on a tender process? What is a tender? And how do you act in the ethical and moral way in your tender process? And through that, we also followed your hypothetical project on the site. So you would be starting the project, and towards the end, what kind of contract would you use? What kind of, how would you appoint your consultants? Would they be directly appointed, indirectly appointed? So it does sound a bit daunting, as you mentioned, Sarah, but it's actually the tools that you need as an architect or as a graduate working in an architecture practice from A to Z, working your way through. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that format of being in the narrative like that does really help make it less intimidating. I also found that it sort of eased you in as well with the sort of broader, bigger things. And then by the end, you get down to the nitty gritty of contract administration. And of course, we should say that I guess what's driving the content in each of those subjects is the topics that need to be known that are set by the Accreditation Council of Australia to meet that registration standard. So I know they also have they're really nice. They have a big spreadsheet that you can get that goes through every competency expected for an architect. And it sort of has a checkbox of, well, yes, we think you learned that at university, so that's why you prove your university degree. And then it has the checkbox of things that are tested on the exam and the checkbox that's tested at the interview. So anyone who's wanting a bit more understanding of the sort of whole picture of the competency of an architect in Australia can check that out. Which sort of leads me on to, do people thinking about approaching registration need to feel a level of competence or experience with those topics before facing registration and taking part in PALS?
I would say no, because I think to answer that question, we have to look at the origins of PALS when it started over 20 years ago. Architects back in the day, and I guess the same applies still for today, realized that graduates were really struggling in practice, that university or wherever they studied prepared them for the theoretical and the design side, but not necessarily for practice, not contracts or working with clients, etc. So they decided that they need to set up a program that can aid graduates, that can help them on this pathway so that practice is not as daunting and that you're not just thrown into the deep end. So personally, in my opinion, I would say start as soon as possible because yes, your director might say, yes, she'll take you to site so that you can gain experience, shadow me, and I'll take you to all my meetings so that you can understand how to work with clients. But at the end of the day, if you've never read the client architect agreement, are you really going to pick up as much from those meetings with her or him if you've never read through it? So the sooner, in my opinion, you start with that PALS program and you go through everything, you will just be a better employee in your practice and you will absorb more in every single project and yeah, that you're currently busy working with. So no, I would say definitely start as soon as possible.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think the logbook is the determining factor about whether you're really ready to take on the process. So I would use it as your sort of yardstick for how ready you are. And then don't worry if the topics sound intimidating, because I think for all of us learnt a lot of new things studying for registration. And as you say, that's sort of the point. It's to make sure you are really well-rounded and you're prepared for a lot of horrible situations that might occur and how to manage difficult things like that. And you can't possibly have exposure to all those situations in the early years of your career.
No, absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, my understanding is as well that they're basically just trying to test whether you will act as a responsible person. And part of acting as a responsible architect is if you don't know an answer, you cannot be expected to know everything. It is just too much. There's just way too much. For example, in my interview, there was a question that I had no idea what the answer was to that. But as a responsible person, I can tell them that I'm going back to the office. I'm going to review my notes. I'm going back to the contract. I'm going to ask my director, or I'm going to the acumen notes. So I'm asking a colleague because then at least I'm acting in a responsible manner versus just, I don't know what the answer is, or giving a wrong answer, which is even more wrong. Rather say, I will come back to you. I will first have to review my contract, or I first have to just get confirmation from my director, or first have to review the drawings in the office. That is a responsible person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had a similar situation in my exam too. So I think that's a really important thing, a useful thing to note. Otto, you mentioned that it's now online, and obviously it has to be online essentially with COVID, but I'm interested about after COVID, hopefully that's a thing. Will it stay online? Will there still be sessions in certain states? I know when I did it, we would catch up every fortnight with local practitioners to talk us through certain topics.
Yep. So to answer your question on that, the main aim that we've been busy with in the last year, and this was even before COVID, was to get everything online. Because we did quite an extensive survey with graduates, and the biggest feedback that we got is that graduates are, of course, busy. They're working long hours, and it's really tough to then, after work, come to sessions, absorb a lot of info. So we wanted to give you guys just a little bit more flexibility. So after this, the modules will remain online. The face-to-face sessions have been pre-recorded. It's been done in New South Wales, but the tutors came all across Australia, whether it was from Queensland or Victoria or wherever, and they went through 21 modules and they literally covered everything that they could think on that topic. So that's recorded, so you will have access to that whenever you want to, on your own time, your own leisure. you can go through that. In terms of the face-to-face sessions, yes, there will still be face-to-face sessions in some states and territories, but we also are running the online case studies, which, as I mentioned, which is pretty similar to this as the Zoom studies sessions, where we will be sitting with experts, and that's pretty much what we're doing, and then just going through that. And again, that's also recorded, so afterwards you can then go back and review it, and if something didn't make sense, you can go back. And it's also, I think, to give graduates access to the same information. We had quite a number of regional members who, and rightly so, were really stuck in terms of how do we access Sydney or Melbourne, and where I'm stuck in a regional area, I've got to drive or how far for every session. So that's why we try to make sure that everything is now more focused online, but you can still obviously form your own groups and study groups, and which I would really encourage to do as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I remember my in-person sessions were Saturday afternoons. I missed a lot of my precious Saturday afternoons doing it. So it's good. And I think as long as there are those opportunities to still meet up with the other people that are studying in your area and perhaps make study groups to go through things. So I think it's pretty exciting, the new format. I should note here, I popped a link in the notes, an article I did recently with 4 recently registered architects in Australia, and they each gave really insightful information about how they found the process and what their tips were. So that one's in the links, as well as one on thoughts on when you should actually start writing your registration logbook, which is always a big question. So we won't go into that topic so much now, but there is a link there. I noticed some people that are here live are saying where they're from. Thank you for that. I love hearing. We've got Canberra, Perth, Melbourne and Brisbane covered, so that's pretty exciting. Do pop in your questions as we go along and I can throw them to Otto. Otherwise, we'll just keep going with my questions. Otto, do you have to be a member of the Institute to take part, and what does it cost for all of this incredible knowledge?
No, you don't have to be a member. Of course, if you're not a member, you are going to pay more. So for a non-member, it's, if I remember correctly, it's more or less $1,224, round about there. If you are part of an A+ practice, it is in the region of $510. And if you're not part of an A+ practice, it's $785. But saying that, additional discounts also apply for multi-user purchases. So if a couple of you in your practice are purchasing it together, let's say an A+, then that $510 will go down to 400 and something.
Ah, okay. That's a good point, because I think a lot of students and graduates don't even realize that the practice they work in has this A+ membership. So it's really worth checking that, because you can get a lot of benefits from the Institute membership. And how does that just get you through it once? What happens if you want to do it a second time?
No, so you've got access to the PALS program for a year. So so as I mentioned before, if you, let's say for example, fail, then you've got the second round to do that. Or if you just want to take it at a slower pace and just want to take an entire year, and because you only want to study bite-sizable sizes in a day, or you don't want to be rushed, then you can do it over a year.
Yeah, that's really great. So I know that in Victoria there is an alternate service provider that offers an exam preparation training course. And as far as I know, they're the only other option, apart from just studying the Acumen notes yourself, which we should say is a path that you could choose to take.
Yep. You can.
It'd be pretty hard though, wouldn't it?
It's going to be a very hard route. So it is absolutely possible. But at the end of the day, I think you have to look probably at the bigger picture, that PALS have been developed over 25 years. So over 25 years, experts and architects have just been streamlining every year a bit more and a bit more and making it more efficient for you. So yeah, you can do the Acumen notes, go through it and search through it and do that, but um, it's going to take quite a bit of your time. So maybe if
Yeah,
you're
it's
really experienced, you can try that route, but I wouldn't
yeah,
recommend it personally.
I definitely would not have been able to, and I'm not sure I know anyone that would. You'd have to be a very special type of person. But I think it's important to note it for the full spectrum of where PALS is sitting. But yeah,
Absolutely.
having it walked through would be just make your life so much easier.
Exactly. And even when I did it myself, as I said last year, it was very it made it easier for you just to know that, okay, next week we're covering this, the week after that we're covering this, these are your notes, this is where you need to go cross-reference, this is where you need to go look up in the Acumen notes. It just makes it so much easier.
That's
So
it. It's that
yeah,
nice combination of, I imagine it's still similar, where it tells you a bit and then gives you a bit to go read and
exactly.
makes it digestible, really. Um, Now we've covered that you can attempt again if you need to. You don't have to pay the full price.
No, you don't have to pay anything, so yeah.
Yeah. We're going to be approaching the end, so if we have left anything off for anyone that's watching, or you've got any burning questions, please pop it in the chat. But I think we've covered it off fairly thoroughly. I remember doing PALS quite clearly. It was definitely the right pathway for me. And I mentioned I'm in the ACT, so we had quite a small PALS program at the time, and you didn't have that flexible option. So we all rocked up on our Saturday afternoon. The benefit of that was that we did form our own study groups. So I'm really glad to see there's still avenues that people can meet other people who are going through it as well. It really helped us back up that learning and wrap our heads around it. Because you have to get into such detail, really. So discussing it with others is handy. And I think those tutorials, we had them with local practitioners, but I think it'd be fantastic to have them pre-recorded with people who really do know what they're talking about in the specific topic. And it was kind of invigorating to hear real practitioners talk candidly about a lot of those topics and issues, because you just don't get that. And you hear some incredible scenarios that they wouldn't tell you otherwise. So I think PALS is great, even for that, just that idea of seeing that full spectrum of practice that's often shielded from you when you're working in a practice. How do you remember your own PALS experience, Otto?
I'm not gonna lie to you. It was really painful and it was really stressful. But at the end of the day, I think you've got to look at the bigger picture. The exam is important. Yes, it is. But the knowledge that you need from those sessions and the knowledge that you gain from it is more important in the long run, in my opinion. So that helps you. And that is the valuable information. So yes, I know everybody is obviously very excited to go out there and just become registered and call themselves an architect, etc., etc. But as I said, maybe look at the journey and the path that you have to follow with it. And every bit that you gain in those sessions is something that you can then apply in your practice. And that is, I think, personally, more important. So when I started realizing that and actually starting to apply that in practice, it was like, oh, okay, I absolutely get it. I do understand why I need this information. Because otherwise, if you suddenly start working with an ABIC contract, or you suddenly thrown in with a client architect agreement and you get a clause, you go crazy because you don't know where to go look. Now you do. At least you know where to go look for some bits of information and you're pointed in the right direction. So I would say from my side, it took quite a lot of stress away and it took quite a lot of just of the searching away, because finally you knew where to go get the answers.
Yeah.
In the thick of things and in a project, like I said, just jumping onto Acumen and finding a note there, or just knowing that, oh, this is covered in the client architect agreement. I can now finally understand what is the obligations of the client, what is the obligations of me. So yeah, so
I think that's a really good mindset point. We focus on learning it just to get through the exam, but there's a much bigger reason we're doing it. We have had a couple of questions come through, Otto. Georgina's wondering, do you have any tips for graduates who want to register, but it isn't a priority for the practice they're working for? So I guess Georgina's talking about helping you get the right experience, so that you've checked off those logbook items and can approach registration.
what I would say in that scenario is, if your practice is, as you said, not so set on you perhaps becoming registered, I would perhaps ask myself, is it not more important for myself and my career? Because at the end of the day, I want to be an architect. I studied, and I see this as the last bit in my architectural career to call myself an architect. And also, on top of that, what value you would add to them by having gone through this and actually understanding all that phases, actually understanding every single session in terms of what is expected of an architect. It will just make you a better employee and a more responsible employee. And you, at the end of the day, you will have better tools even to approach your project with, if you will. So yeah, I would absolutely perhaps discuss that with your directors, and perhaps
Yeah.
first decide for yourself as well, what is your priority? I mean,
Yeah, sadly, it's not an uncommon situation to be in, Georgina. And
mm,
it's something I did sort of cover a little bit in my book, 101 Things I Didn't Learn in Architecture School, which there is a link to below. But I think the creative way of getting around it, and I put it under the point called making the most of being naive, is that if you really can't get it, or perhaps your firm has the best intentions but just doesn't have the right experience, for example, contract administration, you may be able to find an avenue where you could make an agreement with another peer in the industry that you could shadow them for a few hours a week on your own time. You do have to be careful about how you would approach that. You'd have to check that your firm was okay with it and they were okay with it. But I think that could be one avenue you could go through, and it's one that I know we've talked about amongst friends that have been in a similar situation. Ronald wants to know if there's any place in the PALS program information that gives a clearer definition of each of the 15 competencies that you have to log hours against. So I think that's more of an AACA question, isn't it, Otto?
absolutely. So yeah, definitely you have to go to the AACA's website.
I'll add that link in.
Yep. So they do set out the matrix of every single competency you need and which one you need to cover. But saying that, when we develop PALS and through the years, we've made sure that that is also covered in the program. So all of that should be covered.
Yeah, I remember being quite daunted about, where do I log this hour? I don't understand what the competencies are. So I will add a link in, but also if you check that article of mine called How to Become a Registered Architect in Australia, it has that link to the various resources in the AACA that cover those competencies quite clearly. Georgia had asked, do you have any tips on how unemployed master's students can start to gain knowledge on the main subjects before gaining employment? That's an interesting one. I
So
mean, I think you can look at Acumen. If you're finding yourself twiddling your thumbs while you're waiting to find employment, there's no reason why you couldn't start trawling through Acumen, but I'm not sure how valuable it'd be at that point.
yeah, and perhaps what you could do as well is maybe speak to one of your institute should probably not be listening to me right now, but maybe speak to one of your mates who have done the old course and the older notes, because those notes are not redundant. They're still very valuable. And maybe just start working your way through that as well. So when you do, at the end of the day, start purchasing the new PALS program, you just have more and more knowledge. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure one of your friends should have the older notes, that you could perhaps just start, yeah, like working through that. And something that you could do, what I would really, really strongly recommend is, the client architect agreement, for example, is for free. I think the ARB
Mm,
has one that's on their website. We have one that's on our website. That's a copy, of course, so you cannot use it unless you purchase it, but you can download it and read through it. Because in my mind, the client architect agreement sets out everything you need to know in terms of what's your responsibility with the client and the architect and what's your role. And then that's already one massive chunk of your work covered. And then after
yeah.
that, you could look at a procurement contract. Again, something like perhaps the AB contract, which is, I would probably say, uh, yeah, I would look at one of the AB contracts,
Mm,
because what you could do then is, if you go through that contract, you don't need to know all the clauses by heart. You just need to understand what it means when there's a dispute. You have to understand what it means when what your obligations are. So if you go through the contract, you understand again what your role is towards the builder. So then you've already covered two major chunks of work. So that's something that you could already
yeah.
start with.
Yeah, you absolutely could. I think I'd just add, Georgia, though, not to stress too much about needing to learn it. I know when I graduated, I was like a bull at a gate wanting to get registered absolutely as soon as I could. And, I did it the 18 months after, which is very early, really, compared to most people. And it's, you don't have to put that pressure on yourself. Um, I think if there's other things that you think you could be bolstering your skills with in terms of professional development to prepare yourself for getting work in a practice, you know, maybe they're more valuable. Obviously, it's a personal situation, but it is nice just knowing humans there, because you can sort of choose to study all elements of practice, not even just the things for registration. There's the environmental design guide notes, etc. Where should I start to gain knowledge? This is from Lindsay. To work in an Australian architecture practice, Australian standards, terms in Australian architecture, stages of a project, documents, and detail of plans. That's a really relevant one to you, Otto. When you arrived, did you just get a job in a firm, or did you find some resources to help introduce you before?
No, I just started working in a practice, and that was pretty much be my advice. Start working as soon
Yeah,
as possible, and
yeah.
you will gain the knowledge as you go through it. And the best advice that I ever got from one of my senior directors is, if you get one of those AS clauses that you have no idea what it means, where it comes from, take a deep breath and go to the library or wherever the AS or the building codes or is stored or saved, and just go through it. Eventually, you will start picking up on those codes and regulations, and that's why I think that's pretty much picking up on the first, or what you said a little bit earlier, Sarah. Is, I know, for example, a lot of um, architects, especially the more tier one companies, would recommend to their graduates that you sometimes need 5 years before you should even consider writing the exams, because
Especially if you're in
yeah,
commercial practice where it takes that
exactly.
long to see a whole project through.
Exactly. You might be pigeonholed in one specific task, and you're just not getting that experience. So yeah, I would say you're probably never going to be ready for it. And that's why I would say just start going through the notes as soon as possible, when you can, when you feel ready, and start working. As soon as you work, you will gain the knowledge and experience as you go along.
And Lindsay, this is totally a shameless plug, but my book, 101 Things I Didn't Learn in Architecture School, I really wrote it to cover that gap between university and practice. and it's for the Australian context. So it covers basic construction and construction terms, but then it also goes through all of the planning legislation in Australia, all of the different rules that you have to apply to, how firms are generally structured in Australia. So even though I wrote it for that gap between university and practice, I've had a lot of feedback from people who didn't study in Australia or are coming to Australia even later in their career, that it's a really useful introduction to them to that Australian practice setting. And finally, Sarah had asked a question about the industry at the moment during and getting a job during COVID. And I'm just going to refer on those ones to a previous session we did on the only other video on our channel. It's called You Can't Ask That. We asked 3 Australian designers 47 anonymous questions, and there's a huge amount in there about getting a job, and particularly at the industry at the moment. We filmed it in late March, I think, so it was highly relevant. So please check that one out. One more question from Sam does being a registered architect in Australia, is it recognised in overseas firms or give you any opportunities to work in abroad other than New Zealand? That's a good question.
So no. And one of the things that, well, no and yes. First of all, you have to also realize when you become a registered architect, like for example, Sarah, who is an ACT, cannot call herself a registered architect in New South Wales unless she is registered over here. And likewise, I cannot call myself a registered architect over there. Or even in Queensland, I'm just a registered architect in New South Wales. So if I get a commission or a job in Northern Territory, I first have to register myself over there. It doesn't mean that I cannot work, I cannot become registered, or I have to go through the exams again. I just have to go to the registration board and find out what the processes are. So the same will also apply when you go and work overseas. So for example, when I, as a South African who went to work over in UK, my degree was fully accredited by the UK, in the UK, because the South African program was recognized. But likewise, I couldn't call myself an architect over there. Saying that, your employer will recognize you if you have gone through the process, because they would know that this person already has X amount of knowledge. Because in my mind, if you are a registered architect, let's say coming from America, and you are registered, that says to me that you've gone through certain programs to study and understand how clients work, how contracts work, how disputes work. So that would definitely count in your favor. But no, you won't be able to call yourself an architect over there.
Yeah, I think you mentioned earlier, Otto, that the UK, for example, has really similar terminology. And I've had a couple of friends purposefully get registered here just before going to work in the UK because their registration was really respected, even though they couldn't call themselves an architect. And just to clarify, to register in a different state, you don't have to do all the exam and everything again. That's where those boards come into play. So, for example, I am registered in the ACT and New South Wales, and it just means that I have to keep my fees and my CPD commitments up to both of those boards to sort of maintain that licensing and check that I'm doing everything correctly.
Yep.
We're going to end it there. Thanks so much for your time, Otto. I wish I had been able to have a chat like this before I went into the really daunting process. So it's just fantastic, and your unique position as well. I think, you know, having just registered and then going into PALS and having experience writing the exam, it's really amazing, actually. So thanks so much for sharing all that knowledge you've collected with us.
No worries. And thank you so much for running this. This is really quite amazing. So yeah, and I'm definitely going to look at your book now.
All right. Thanks, Otto. And thanks everyone who signed on. I'll catch you later. Bye.
Okay, bye.